Hello, you're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher, the programme that brings you stories and news from Israel through the voices of the believers in Jesus who live there, Jews and Arabs. Recently, I was in Tel Aviv and met with Shira Sorko Ram, who, with her husband Ari, lead a congregation called Ma-oze. It's taken over 40 years of hard work to reach where they are today, not only meeting each week as a congregation, but also caring for the needy and encouraging many individuals and groups to reach out to Israeli society with the gospel, creatively and boldly. Today, Shira describes some of the most significant events of the past 40 years, events that have shaped her life and the life of Israelis.
When I first came here in 1967, it was right after the Six-Day War. And there was a euphoria that anyone who landed in this country could feel. It was that, we have beaten the Arabs, and they have finally understood that they cannot destroy us. And so this will be the last war, and there won't be any more wars here because they finally learned their lesson. Now, when I came in 1967, and this was just a couple of months after the very famous Six-Day War, I saw what was going on. I saw how excited everybody was. Israelis were running over to the Western Wall where they had not been able to go since Israel became a state in 1948. And it was just, you couldn't help but be excited for Israel, even though I knew in the Bible that this certainly was not the last war. You still had to breathe in the excitement of the nation. And so that was probably such a dramatic event for me coming here, and I decided to stay. I was working on some documentary films, so that kept me here, and then I realized that I was really called to be here, and I became a citizen 3 years later. But after 6 years came the infamous Yom Kippur War. And that was so shocking, so surprising, that Israel was never the same after. Never that euphoria, that excitement, that glee or happiness of Israel becoming a state on its own, a democratic state, has never returned to this country. And it's been a battle ever since that.
You married, and you and your husband, to fast forward, started this organization, Ma-oz. What does it mean?
In Hebrew, it's Ma-oz, and it means fortress or strength. And we took it from the scripture, "The Lord is my strength." And we thought, boy, without that, we're not going anywhere in this country. So Ma-oz is what we depend upon. And in Israel, we have to have our own companies here in order to be according to the law. And so here we're Ma-oz Tzur, which means fortress of rock, of the rock. And we know who the rock is. So we're really depending on that solid rock to keep us going, because the spiritual battles in Israel are unlike anything else you will see or hear of, I think, in the world. There are spiritual battles in every single place that people are trying to do anything for God. But the spiritual battles in this country, people who have lived in other countries and then also here say there's just nothing quite like it, because it just comes from every direction and in ways that you would just never dream. The plumber was supposed to come and I don't want to be over dramatic, but he dies, and then you're spending another 2 weeks looking how to get the flood out of your house. I mean, it's just constant resistance to normal life in this country.
So why is that?
Why is that? Because according to the Bible, the last great war for the hearts and souls of man is going to be in this country, according to the book of Joel, according to most of the prophets, and even Yeshua, Jesus said that Jerusalem shall be trodden down. Trodden down, that means put underfoot by the nations, by the Gentiles, meaning the nations of the world, until the times of the nations is over. And the book of Zechariah talks about this horrible war that's going to take place here. But I have to always add that the people who are not living in Israel should not think that everything is going to be just great in their nations, because those same prophets talk about world wars. And really, without the rock for believers in every country in this world, nobody is going to be safe.
You're well established now. Ma-oze has grown. But when you were starting off, Shira, how did you start in those early days? What were the first things that you did?
Well, let me think. When I first came to the country in 1967, there were only a handful of believers. And almost all of those were immigrants. Some of them actually had come out of Europe from the Holocaust. And these dear, dear saints were very damaged and abused. And so there was no strong leadership in the country among believers, except here and there. In Jerusalem, there were a few really fine leaders, but the country was empty of born-again Jewish people. They didn't exist. There might have been one in Haifa and two here, but that was it. So where do you start? After several years, I came to the conclusion that there was two ways to see a movement take place here. Either you take Israelis who know nothing about God, nothing about Messiah, nothing. If you would talk about worshiping the Lord, they would think you were talking about something on the other side of the moon. In other words, it's as pagan as it could be. So you would have to take an Israeli who knows the culture, knows the language, but knows nothing about the Lord as a personal relationship and living in a personal way with God. Now, so that's one possibility. The other possibility was encouraging Jewish believers from the West who knew the Lord and had grown in maturity, but they didn't know the language and they didn't know the culture of Israel. Now, both of those learning curves are horrendous. They're really, really huge. But I finally came to the conclusion that it would be easier to find some Jewish believers from the West and that they immigrate here and learn the language than to try to reach Israelis. At that time, when I would witness to an Israeli, they'd say, well, that's a very interesting theology you have. Are you the only one in the world who believes this? And so it's difficult. There's not that many people with leadership ability. They're sheep. They want to follow. They want to see after other people are believing. So I actually went to the United States and started beating the bushes, looking for Jewish believers who would come to Israel to live, because Jews can come and receive citizenship. What was interesting, I found countless Christians, non-Jewish Christians, who would love to have come to Israel, but they couldn't get rights to stay here. But most of the Jewish believers that I met, they would say, well, God hasn't called me yet. So it was an uphill battle, but one of the first very few Jewish believers that came after my beating the bush trip to the States was my own husband, who was actually an actor in Hollywood, Jewish believer, and he actually listened to what I had to say about the need for born-again Jewish believers, and he came to the country, and after about 8 months, we were married.
You then established a small congregation. Was it in your own home?
It was in our own home, and most of them were immigrants who had come and were getting established, learning the language, learning the culture. It wasn't easy, and usually for anybody moving to Israel, going from, let's say, English or a Western language to Hebrew is very difficult. Almost always the immigrants who bring children in any grade, let's say 3rd, 4th, 5th grade on up, the first year is unbelievable. They can't understand what's going on. They feel rejected of mankind. But by the second year, usually kids can learn the language. Now, the hardest, of course, is in the 10th, 11th, 12th grades. Then that really becomes a challenge. But usually the young people do make it, and then they go into the Army, and their language skills are even honed in there. And people make it. It's difficult, but people do it.
Shira Sorko Ram sharing her story and the story of Ma-oze, the congregation in Tel Aviv that she and her husband Ari started 40 years ago. And we'll hear more from Shira on next week's programme. You're listening to The Olive Tree with me, Julia Fisher. And the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund is a Christian charity based in the UK that supports the needs of both Jewish and Arab Christians living in the Holy Land, especially those involved in reconciliation. So if you'd like to know more about our work and receive our free bi-monthly newsletter, do visit our website www.olivetreefund.org or write to me, Julia Fisher, at the Olive Tree Reconciliation Fund, P.O. Box 850, Horsham, RH12 9GA in the UK. I'll be back at the same time next week for another story from the Olive Tree. Until then, goodbye.